My guest is Dr. Thomas Murphy, an astrophysicist who works as a professor at University of California, San Diego. Tom, how are you doing today?
Doing fine, thanks.
Great. Tell us about your work and what kinds of interesting work do you get to do as an astrophysicist?
Well, for me, that's a story of looking into the past because I'm kind of a recovering astrophysicist. Definitely, sorry about the cat,
That's fun.
fun career in terms of being distracting and entertaining and challenging and heady in terms of dealing with cosmology and how we got here and some of the big questions. I guess for most of my career, I spent shooting a laser at the moon to measure the distance to the reflectors that the astronauts left on the lunar surface, measuring Earth-Moon distance to millimeter accuracy as a way to test gravity, to see if the moon's orbit was following the prescription that general relativity lays out, or if it was departing from that prescription. So, fundamental tests of physics, and it's just really fun to build a piece of equipment that works and measures something to a relic from our glorious space history. So nobody can tell me that the landings were faked, because I personally built the laser system that reached out and touched those reflectors, and yes, they're exactly where they're supposed to be, exactly the size they're supposed to be. So it was definitely a fun journey.
Sounds great. So you brought some notes with you. Did you want to read the story that you brought with you?
Well, yeah, this is experimental. I wrote it down last night because I'm thinking about how to tell this story in general. And so I haven't read through it yet, and we'll see how it goes. But basically, what I want to get across is that the story of where we are is actually pretty simple, that humans have been around in some form for about 2.5 million years. And I want to compare that to a human lifetime, because that's something that we have some intuition for. So let's say that's about 75 years. The Homo sapiens brand of humans has only been around for the last 200,000 years or so. So that's kind of 6 years on our lifetime. And agriculture started about 1,000 years ago. That's 15 weeks. We've just been doing this in our whole lifetime as humans. This is a very new thing. 15 weeks we've been doing this. And think of this as our first attempt to exert control or mastery over other species. Before, the emphasis was on learning how to live with other species and, mesh into that ecosystem. But agriculture kind of took a whole different turn. Science is just the last 400 years, and that's just 4 days of our lifetime. And that's precision control. That's taking control up to a whole new level of sophistication and success at some level. Then the fossil fuel explosion of the last 150 years, that's a game changer. That basically put this control on steroids. Now it's power and control. So we can move mountains. We can mine materials that were inaccessible before. We can form a global civilization, and it just makes so many more things possible. So in that giant, recent explosion of resource availability, we've seen about a 70% decline in vertebrates just in the last 50 years, which is the last 12 hours of our life. So imagine you've lived a nice 75-year-old year long life, and in the last 12 hours you see your environment just collapsing. You should be alarmed at that. You should think something really big is happening. So at this point, 96% of mammal mass on the planet is in the form of humans and our livestock. Only 4% wild mammals. So we're really squeezing this precious planet to death. And it's all very new. So it's really
Let's
go ahead.
review those numbers real quick again. You're saying that Homo sapiens has been here 200,000 years. So let's analogize that to a 70-year lifespan, 80-year lifespan, something like that.
So I'm taking all humans for 2.5 million years as the whole
Okay.
lifespan.
Okay.
And so Homo sapiens is just the last 200,000, which is 6 years in this
Okay.
period. Yeah.
And then what are the other time frames?
And then agriculture started 10,000 years ago, which is 15 weeks in our lifetime. Very recent. You
Right.
remember what you were doing 15 weeks ago. It's recent history. So science, the last 400 years, which is just the last 4 days of our life, we picked up a new hobby, suddenly. And then fossil fuels, just the last 36 hours. And then the species decline just in the last 12 hours. We've seen it decline 70%. Very rapid. And so it's like it's a hard crash. It's a slam. And even though a lot of it has been about control and exercising greater control, we're kind of out of control. This is really a free fall that's hitting the planet hard. And this is a problem that's not going to be solved by technology and science. I'd say it's caused by technology and science. But we've acquired a certain affinity for that approach. And even though it's not gone so well. So we're not going to outsmart this. We're not just going to somehow find all the right knobs and turn them and tweak them and suddenly master this spaceship. We never have been able to do that. We're only opening up more cans of worms and creating problems much faster than anything we're solving. So almost all of this too has been just based on non-renewable finite resources, like an inheritance, and we're spinning it as fast as humanly possible. And that's another context that we have to understand, that this is a very recent phenomenon that is by definition going to go poorly because it's a finite resource. Our decisions, meanwhile, are based on a shamefully narrow metric called money. And our valuation of things is so completely skewed that it makes bad decisions. We make our decision based on the wrong metric, and then they are just, not surprisingly bad. So our short-term transactional nature has been about the value to us in the short term and not to other life in our habitat. So we're putting value on the wrong things. So of course this system is going to fail. It's not built on a foundation of sustaining ecosystems. It's a growth system in a finite world. Of course that fails.
Right.
It's inevitable. So, in fact, I talked about financial things. Money goes in the exact opposite direction to, sustainable practices. Money is about exploiting, not resources, and not about preserving or
let's talk about that. One of the things that you said, I discovered you on Nate Hagen's podcast, and you said something that, if we assume economic growth of 2.33% per year, year over year, then over the course of 100 years, the economy has expanded by a factor of 10. So if we start where we are, 100 years from now, it's going to multiply by 10. If it keeps growing at 2.33% per year, it's going to be 100 in 20 years, Anyway, each 100-year period, it expands by a factor of 10. And economic growth in our system tends to correlate to the growth in the use of energy. So that would seem to go straight to the issue of you're dealing with infinite growth on a finite planet. How does that end? Or, what are some of the limitations of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very relevant line of thinking, and one that I've used often to indicate that this growth phase is a very temporary phase. And again, this timeline that I've laid out is trying to emphasize that as well, that this is a very recent, untested, short-term phenomenon that can't go on for the long term. So just in terms of physical measures, if we expanded our use of energy by a factor of 10 every century, which is historically kind of the rate at which we have grown, it leads to absurd results in just a few hundred years. Like the waste heat from all that energy, inevitable waste heat thermodynamically, puts climate change to shame. And, in 200 years from now, it's 10 times bigger than our climate change concerns at present.
So waste heat grows at the same rate as energy usage, and
Yeah.
therefore at 2.33% a year, it's going to be 10 times as much in 1 century and 100 times as much in 2 centuries.
That's right. And it just keeps getting worse. And now a couple things. I'm not claiming that waste heat is our real big enemy. That's not what's going to get us. A lot of other things are going to prevent that kind of growth trajectory from being maintained over that kind of period. I'm just pointing out that even if you wave your magic wand and allow growth to continue for all the reasons that I think it really can't, then you'd run into waste heat. The other thing to point out is the 2.3% is just a mathematical convenience to get to that factor of 10 per century, which makes it a lot easier to think about, but it's also consistent with
it's consistent with historical economic growth for the last 300 or 400 years, and it's consistent with the assumptions of the IPCC. If I'm not mistaken, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assumes 3% growth, and they pretend to be able to tell us what the solutions are, but they're also telling us that it's okay for us to have 3% growth.
Yeah, and that's actually, I'm glad you bring it up, because one of the things about IPCC models is they start with the politically acceptable.
Yes,
and they
exactly.
say, what would the consequences of this be? And they're not starting from what is physically possible. And so it's a kind of a fantasy model that is, I think of physics as inviolate, and you can't just sort of design the world to your imagination. And that's kind of what a lot of these IPCC models do. I think in some ways, the situation is much worse than what they are modeling, because we're not going to follow that trajectory. Worse for civilization, but in a way better for the environment, because we're not going to have that continued growth that would produce all that CO2. And so it's going to be a self-terminating process in a way that's not going to be very satisfying or pretty to humans who like.
So it's as if the conversation around climate is like this. It's defined by 2 camps. One camp is fossil fuels all the time, no problem. The other camp is we need to get off of fossil fuels and convert to 100% renewable energy. And I think you and I are both saying, how about none of the above? Because both camps are assuming economic growth. That's one problem with that conversation. Another problem with that conversation, as you have written, let me just share with you a quote from I don't know exactly which blog post it is, but you say, as bad as climate change is, it's not the core problem, just another symptom of a flawed approach to life on this planet. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, it really is just a symptom, in the sense that if magically CO2 didn't happen to interact with infrared radiation, I mean, it could have been that way, it's just not. But let's say that the burning of fossil fuels did not create a greenhouse gas that caused problems, we would still have destroyed 70% of vertebrates since 1970. We would still have 4% of mammals on this planet in the form of wild mammals. Climate change is not what did those things. Climate change is not what's clearing forests. It's not what's disrupting habitats. It's not what's causing soil erosion, desertification, water issues. I mean, if you look around, we're really just kind of circling the drain here. And climate change is just another headache on top of all of this.
Right.
And-
So one thing that
Yeah.
you sent me was an article from The Intercept that says addressing climate change will not, quote unquote, save the planet. I'm saying, yeah, finally, from a semi-mainstream publication, I would like for this to be shouted from the rooftops. Addressing climate change will not save the planet.
Exactly.
And the subtitle of that is the dismal reality is that green energy will not save the complex web of life on Earth, but the particular way of life of one domineering species. And the article quotes Dan Ash, director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under President Barack Obama. It says, I'm 40 years into conservation biology, and I can tell you we are losing badly, getting our asses kicked. He says there are almost no reasons to be optimistic. And lastly, he says the lie is that if we address the climate crisis, we will also solve the biodiversity crisis.
Right. It is a lie because it's not climate change that's making the biodiversity crisis. It's not making it any better. And, that article got some criticism as sort of walking right up to the line of climate denialism. And I say, what? At what point did this article ever,
Yeah.
sort of dismiss climate change as not a legitimate threat? It didn't. It just said that's not the main threat. And I agree with that. I think if we were to suddenly, again, wave a magic wand and we have no more fossil fuels and we have complete renewable energy infrastructure that lets us keep doing what we're doing at the level that we're doing it today, it's the worst possible outcome for the squirrels.
Mm-hmm.
They would hate to see us succeed
Mm-hmm.
in that quest, because what do we use energy to do?
Exactly.
We use it to exploit and destroy ecosystems. That is our way.
Yeah.
So giving us more of it is the worst possible thing we could do.
So you're saying, I think Wendell Berry said this 45 years ago in his book, The Unsettling of America, which is hypothetically, if we had unlimited, clean, free energy, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? And the whole renewable energy movement says that if we just need to change the way we generate energy, and if we can just change the way we generate energy, then we will save the planet. So you're
Yeah,
skeptical of that, right?
yeah, the implicit statement there is civilization is not the problem. It's just the
Mm-hmm.
form of our energy. I say, no. It's our entire approach to living on this planet
Right.
is what's causing the problem. And it almost doesn't matter what we use and how we use it. And I'm not going to be as eloquent as Wendell Berry, but the way I think of it is, if every jackass on the planet had unlimited access to energy, why would we expect good things to come from that? It's
Right.
going to be chaos and
Mm-hmm.
devastation
Yeah.
for short-term personal gain.
Yeah. And then as the economy grows at 2 or 3% per year, then our energy usage grows at 2 or 3% per year. And we're just more and more and more and more energy to do what we do. It's like a species that is making 150 other species go extinct every day doesn't need more energy to do more of what it does.
Right. We would just get better at that. Better at driving ourselves into the hole. And it's basically, we're in a car and we've got an accelerator and our foot's on the accelerator. We are deciding to push the accelerator more, even though the very act of moving down the road is destroying everything around us. And we don't need to do more of that.
Right.
We need to really step back and ask, wait, what did we get ourselves into? And we sort of unwittingly followed this course because we saw conveniences and comforts and material goods and food and other resources that were basically laid out before us if we just chose this path. And of course we're going to follow that path. But now it's very clear that path led to a bad place. is leading to a bad place, and it's all around us now. So we need a different path. We
So
don't
what's
need,
your take on civilization?
well, very complex because I'm embedded in it and I am a beneficiary of it, and I've propagated it. I have contributed to it. And I'm inseparable from it. But I can step back and, it's not about me, it's about, a bigger picture, longer time span. That's one thing that astrophysics kind of lends itself to, is stepping back and feeling insignificant and looking at a larger picture over vast tracts of space and time. So doing that, I basically realized that civilization is incompatible with sustainability, which means that it will fail, because sustainable means success long term.
It means you can continue doing it over and over. And
Right.
that, yeah.
Right. So if it's not sustainable, that means it fails. Okay. So any civilization, I shouldn't even say civilization, any kind of way of living on this planet that is not founded on a sustainable practice will fail. It's written, I mean, it's so obvious, it's almost right there in the word. And so we're so far from sustainable right now that I know that this civilization must fail. And it's taken long enough, and our problem is that it takes at least, more than a lifetime.
Why you
Play
say
out.
the civilization must fail? Why must the civilization fail?
It must fail because it's not founded on sustainable principles. So it's just like saying
What's not sustainable about it?
a rock will fail to fly because a rock is not built on the aerodynamic principles of sustained flight. And so it will, if you launch it, it will fall. And so our civilization has had this upward trajectory, and convinced people who are living very short lifetimes on this trajectory that, well, the story is one of going up. But it's not built to stay up. There's nothing about its design that ever incorporated the notion of what it takes to stay up. And our economic systems, our agricultural systems, none of these decisions really factored in, can this go on forever?
So I have this list of 10 truths, according to you. And through number 3 and number 4 are: our civilization is not any sort of destiny, not the only or best way to organize ourselves on this planet. And number 4 is: we are not building civilization brick by brick according to some master plan aiming toward a better end. No paradise or salvation awaits on the current path.
Right. Yeah, it's all kind of a free-for-all. It's all just sort of, hey, let's try this. We're not really thinking through what the consequences are. We make our decisions again based on money and financial considerations in the short term, and that's leading to a lot of bad decisions because we're not thinking about whether what we're doing is something we could do for 10,000 years. The markets don't care about even 5 years down the road typically. I mean, you do have some bleed over into longer term, but a lot of it's just quarterly. It's very short-term focus. So we're not consciously building towards some better end.
And yet the mainstream climate plans, if you can call them plans, are all about incentivizing the very system that does not have a plan and is not concerned about biodiversity or even human well-being. It's just concerned about making profit. And the prevailing notion coming from the big green groups, coming from the local groups that I'm aware of that promote this, let's just incentivize the money machine, and the money machine will sometimes take care of us if we take care of it.
Yeah, and it's similar to the IPCC approach in that it's not asking, can this be sustained? It's just asking, it's kind of making the statement that, well, people will not want to give up energy. People will not want to give
Yeah.
up comforts. And so we are then obligated to design something that doesn't give up that that luxury. And so, but we don't like the CO2. And so it never really questions, is that luxury something that we can afford, or is it actually something that's killing our own chances at success?
Well, let's continue with the irreverence.
Mhm.
In number 5 on your list, it says technology and innovation are slowing, not accelerating. And next, number 6 says technology, renewable energy, will not solve our big problems.
Yeah, correct. So for the first one, that catches a lot of people off guard because our narrative is that that's who we are. We just progress and things are at a dizzying rate. And the game I like to play there is taking somebody from the year 1900, plucking them down in 1960, and then taking somebody from 1960 and plopping them into 2020. So each spans a 60-year jump. Which one is more bewildered about the world around them? And a lot of people, having not thought about it, just assume that the 1960 to 2020 will be more bewildered. But no, they recognize cars and airplanes and televisions and even computers and calculators, even though they look different and they look better. This dumb rectangle, they'll recognize you're talking on a phone, and they'll say, "Oh, there's no wire, but it must be radio, right? Not
Radio, yeah.
magic." But the 1900 to 1960, the whole household looks different. All these new appliances and cars and TVs and airplanes, helicopters. I mean, unrecognizable practically. I mean, they'd still recognize a house and doors and windows and wheels. So a lot of stuff does carry through. But in my lifetime, I was born in 1970. There haven't been that many just major life-changing innovations. Internet, and a lot of it's been refinement, okay, not spanking new things. And so the parameter space is limited. You don't have an infinite field to just innovate and invent arbitrarily many things. It's constrained, and people don't recognize that.
So you say renewable energy will not solve our big problems. What do you mean by that?
So similar to what I said about, what happens if we provide everybody on the planet with abundant energy? Do we suddenly shape up and, inexplicably stop exploiting resources for our, short-term gain? What tells us that we would even think to do that? So, it's not the form of energy, and climate change is not good. The CO2 is not going to do good things for us or other species. But I like to think of the climate change as like a hangover. It's a really nasty symptom that causes a lot of distress and discomfort. But the real problem is the drinking problem. And so that's our energy habit. That's the real problem. And so we're trying to design a system that lets us keep partying and drinking to excess without this nasty side effect.
You might even say that so-called renewable energy is like the last hurrah of fossil fuels, because it's going to use a lot of fossil fuels without producing very much energy in return. And so it's just the opposite of what it's thought to be.
Yeah, there are two aspects to that. I agree. I mean, we have never built a solar panel or a wind turbine without fossil fuels. We haven't built a hydroelectric dam or nuclear plant. We don't know how to make concrete at scale on electricity. We have to burn stuff. And the simple logic there is that in order to manipulate materials that are strong materials have high melting points, concrete and steel. In order to manipulate them, we basically have to melt them or, destroy them and rearrange all the parts, which means high temperatures. And it's hard to create high temperatures through electricity because that high temperature will destroy the electrical apparatus itself. A heating coil can only get so hot before it itself melts. And so how are you going to melt other products okay, you can have things at different melting points, and tungsten has a higher melting point, whatever. But
solar panels will not make solar panels, and wind turbines will not provide the energy to make wind turbines.
yeah, the process heat is hard. That is a bottleneck
Mhm.
that a lot of people don't really appreciate. The other thing to appreciate is that when it comes to materials like copper and aluminum and other, mined materials, the renewable technologies require often 10 times more of those than the equivalent energy output from fossil fuels. So we have to step up our mining operations way above what we have today to provide an equivalent energy appetite to satisfy that energy appetite. And so, I think of I use squirrels as a stand-in, or sometimes as newts as a stand-in for just non-human life. Are they hoping that we succeed at this renewable transition? It's the worst possible thing we could do to them.
It takes so much infrastructure, for one thing. By the time you make the grid that's required to accommodate solar and wind, that takes a whole lot of energy. Just from an energy and carbon standpoint, it seems to be a non-starter, without even accounting for the biodiversity loss that occurs or the pollution.
Right. It's a very narrow sort of set of considerations. And again, prioritizing our convenience and comfort above everything else. And I guess what I'm saying is that is
term convenience and comfort.
Yeah. The devastating outlook that will fail.
Mhm.
It is guaranteed to fail. And so do you want to be on the side of failure and promote all these things? And I'm not saying we should be promoting fossil fuels. I'm saying the entire habit needs to be challenged. The entire way that we live on this planet needs to be challenged.
Well, I've said for some time, I just pulled a number out of the air, but we need to reduce our energy usage by 75%, because maintaining our current energy usage is not an option. If you look at the consequences of that, increasing our energy usage is not an option. Besides which, there are so many things that we do with that energy. It's like, what do we do with the energy? Do we need to I read from the Energy Information Agency that the United States uses 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy, approximately. So is that going to keep going up? What are we doing with all this energy that we need to maintain and increase that number?
Well, the answer in some ways is just there in the statistics. We're eroding our biodiversity, and that's what we do with our energy surplus. And I'll point out to anybody watching this that you made me turn on my lights.
Right, exactly.
Normally I'd be
I felt
sitting
guilty about it. I really did.
Yeah.
So before we started recording, I asked Tom to turn on his lights because it was a bit dark, and
it has lightened up a little bit.
I felt guilty about it. I know you're trying to do the right thing.
And also I have the cat on my lap.
Yeah, the cat. Right. Yeah, I made the cat jump out, the cat got a ride. You carried the cat to the lights. Right.
But this is our 18-year-old cat. He's doing well.
Let's talk about your hockey sticks. You have hockey stick curves. This is reminiscent of the limits to Club of Rome, limits to growth, which is about 50 years old now. And it says, so a hockey stick curve is something that is flat for a while and then goes up suddenly, like a hockey stick. So the charts that you give include the gross world product, which is similar to GDP, except the whole world. GWP per capita is a hockey stick curve. Energy per capita is not just energy, but energy per capita is a hockey stick curve.
Right.
Copper production, CO2 pollution, plastic pollution are all hockey stick curves. In other words, you look at the graph and you see a sudden jump sometime in the 20th century. And then there are hockey sticks that go down in the wrong direction. The mass of wild mammals on land, the forest cover as a percent of land, and old growth forest cover as a percent of land. And all those things show those things zeroing out in this century.
They're diving hard. It's a free fall. Yeah, it's devastating. And it really, the correlation is not causation, but in this case, I mean, we can connect the dots.
Except this time it is.
Yeah, that all of those things that are going up in our resource use and energy use have direct consequences as we expand and exclude habitat and destroy habitat. And it's a double whammy for the critters, because as climate changes, which is a slower process, I mean, still serious, but it's a kind of happening on a different time scale. As animals might be, tempted to just sort of migrate, they can't anymore, because it's not a contiguous sort of forest that lets them just sort of move as they need to. So they're trapped on these little islands and they'll just die. So it's really, all these hockey sticks have created an exhilarating ride for us, but it's terrifying.
And this is the way it's supposed to be. We think that this is the only way it's supposed to be. In one of your articles, you talk about a group, a cult, that within that cult, everything that seems normal to them, but anybody outside that cult knows that, wow, a lot of what these people believe is not normal. And anybody anybody on the outside looking in at our civilization would be able to recognize that, wow, what these people believe and how they see the world is not normal.
And not only that, but self-destructive. And anybody who, and I'm not a sort of proponent of spacefaring civilizations. I don't think that's a thing. But in a sense, because any civilization, I shouldn't even use that word, but any people, any sort of being that has figured it out for long-term sustainability is not going to be spacefaring. But if such a culture were to look at ours, they would instantly understand that ours is destined to fail in short order, and they would just hang their heads in shame. That,
speaking of space travel, you write that space colonization is an infantile fantasy that is not part of our future.
correct.
This is reminding our viewers and listeners, this is an astrophysicist talking. You would think an astrophysicist would be all on board with space travel, but he says space colonization is an infantile fantasy that is not part of our future.
Yeah, and maybe just to back up that with a little context, I mean, I grew up very, enamored of the space shuttle program, astronomer looking at planets and galaxies and quasars, and just, embedded into the universe and reveling in that, and using big telescopes and high technology, and working with NASA a lot. I got a lot of funding from NASA. I have sat on many NASA panels looking at mission concept studies and proposals to do, Mars landings. I even was the chief principal investigator of a mission concept study to put a transponder on Phobos, a moon of Mars, and sat at the Jet Propulsion Lab in their room where they've got mission control and thermal and optical and navigation and all these different sort of people sort of looking at a design and deciding, if this is all systems are checking out. This didn't materialize into hardware, but I've been in those roles. I've been embedded in this sort of space culture, and but on the flip side, I know a little something about the scale and the hardship of space, and it's something that the entertainment industry distorts to the extent that we're not well calibrated. We have seen it on the screen, and so it feels real, it feels believable, and not really that hard. But just the radiation environment alone is hundreds of times higher than on the surface of the Earth, and so your cancer risk just goes through the roof. And ironically, were you to try to live on Mars, for the radiation alone, you'd have to live in a cave underground and suddenly reflect on the fact that, wait a minute, I thought I was advancing in technology, but now I'm just a caveman. It's like, how did that happen to me? So
we're
but
taking all of these resources and we're using them to get to a planet that is not currently habitable. We're going to expend who knows countless trillions in resources to get to a planet to try to make it habitable, instead of taking the one that we have and making it habitable.
yeah, and part of the language there is, in a sense, part of the problem, and I'm guilty of it too, which is the idea that humans could make anything habitable or not. That is
Right.
not
Mhm.
within our power,
Mhm.
but it's part of our hubris that we are in control of everything,
Mhm.
and we
Mhm.
can make this earth habitable or not. Now, we can clearly do things to make it uninhabitable, but we can't design the complex ecosystems that make a true sustainable existence. We just have to be participants, but not masters, not controllers.
Okay, since you've mentioned hubris, let's talk about the first two items on your list. One is humans are not the reason for all of creation, not the end point or goal in this universe. And you say that human life is no more sacred than that of a wolf, as just one example.
Yeah, and those are hard for a lot of people to swallow, because we have definitely been kind of stewing and in this culture that humans are the best. And this idea of human exceptionalism is, in some ways, our biggest flaw, that sort of puts us above other species, and we're really just animals. And when I say that we're no more valuable than a wolf or any other, I mean, that's just one example. Yeah, what good are we actually? Um, you could make the argument that we're sort of the least valuable species on the planet,
Mhm.
based on how we're handling things. And um, we give ourselves human rights, but they're always to our advantage.
Well,
And
most
most
of what
politics,
we
yeah,
hear about human rights from organizations, institutions that have no respect for human rights themselves.
yeah, and most political skirmishes are just battles over these arbitrary rights. Do you have a right to carry guns or have an abortion? And it's all about rights that we're all just making up. They're all
Mhm.
fictions, they're all fabrications. There's nothing biophysically rooted in any of them. And I think my attitude is more that the time-tested approach that works for millennia and millions of years is a biophysical reality that doesn't have this artificial layer of kind of imposed on it that we have in our legal systems and our political systems and financial systems. Those are all sort of um, artificial designs that we pay more attention to than the underlying reality. And that, again, is just unsustainable, and it doesn't work in the long term. So that the wolf is genetically as complex as we are, and serves a role in an ecosystem that is valuable to the ecosystem. And on the one hand, I would say that, yeah, we share kind of equal value, because neither of us have really that much value in a way.
Mhm.
No individual is really sacred or valuable. The wolf isn't, and we aren't either. We've promoted ourselves into that status, but that's a cheat.
Mhm. So you wrote a book, Energy and Human Ambitions on a Finite Planet, Assessing and Adapting to Planetary Limits. It's about 450 pages, and it's free and online. Anybody that Googles that title can easily find it, Energy and Human Ambitions on a Finite Planet. And your abstract says the message throughout is that humanity faces a broad sweep of foundational problems as we inevitably transition away from fossil fuels and confront planetary limits in a host of unprecedented ways. A shift whose scale and probable rapidity offers little historical guidance.
Yeah. So this is a textbook for non-science majors, college level, but really any high school student should be able to follow it. It's meant to be both readable as an enjoyable read if you enjoy this sort of thing. And so I've had friends and acquaintances who have read it in just a few days. It's not maybe a typical textbook in that sense, but that's the context. I will say that since I wrote it, and it's not that long, I released it in 2021. Is that right? 2020. Gosh, I can't even remember now. That's really kind of crazy. But my thinking has evolved a lot just since then, so that now I think that, a lot of the textbook, a lot of the chapters are about solar and wind and what the pros and cons are. And none of it is sugarcoating. None of it is saying, isn't this amazing? This is where we're heading. It was, pointing out real practical limitations and difficulties and head scratchers. But, more and more, I'm moving into the phase of wondering, well, wait a minute, why are we doing all of these things? What is the overall point? And is any ambition based on this flawed approach to living on this planet just destined to fail? And so shouldn't we really be digging deeper into the roots of who and what we are and why? And so that's kind of a direction I've moved into.
Let me ask you about this. I've been fascinated since I discovered you and Nate Hagens and Simon Michaud and Daniel Schmachtenberger. Somewhere in there, I got the idea that money correlates to energy, and that also money and energy correlate to materials and electrons. So the movement of money is a flow. Money flows through the economy. Energy flows through the economy. Materials flow through the economy, and electrons also. So do all four of those things correlate? And even if they don't, I wouldn't want to get bogged down in that part, but it's just fascinating that, it seems to me that one corollary of this is that if you put more money into the economy, like when Congress spends $367 billion on so-called renewable energy, that necessarily, the money triggers energy triggers materials, which means mining. So
yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that money is a claim on resources, and debt is a claim on future resources. And so we have kind of mortgaged our future and sort of put the chips down, saying that we demand that Earth supply this future resource to make good on our promise. Well, that's not always going to work. It's kind of a Ponzi scheme that is destined again to fail, because it's not respecting the biophysical limits, that you can't put arbitrary claims on a physical resource. It's worked so far because we're still in the kind of we haven't hit the ground yet, so the rock is still going to fly until it hits the ground. And so it seems like you can make up rules that work, but they only work in the short term. But yeah, we are biophysical machines on a biophysical substrate, and those are the inviolate rules that no amount of fancy footwork will get around, because everything involves energy and everything involves materials for us to eat and live.
So far, what's keeping that ball in the air is like money from banks. So banks that are supported by government at taxpayer expense, but government gives money to banks. Banks put money into the economy. The 2008 recovery was all about government throwing money at banks and banks doing whatever they wanted to with it. And even though like the feasibility of getting energy and using it is going to decline over the course of time, it's kind of, this bubble continues because of banking money. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, and my understanding of it is that, there's this thing called fractional reserve banking, where a bank can loan out more money than it has sitting in its vault, and what that does is it puts somebody on the line to pay it back, and how they pay it back is by engaging in the world in some way, making a product or offering a service or doing something that requires energy and materials of value to somebody else. And so in the process of making that loan, the bank has basically said, the earth has got our back. The earth is going to refill the coffers once this person who is now on the hook for paying us back, it incentivizes and in fact mandates them to go out and destroy something in a generic sense in order to pay us back. And so yeah, that financial system is set up to exploit and overexploit, because it doesn't recognize any biophysical limit, and it's just going to keep going until it fails.
Yeah, and you can look at any sector of the economy. You can look at transportation, you can look at food and agriculture, you can look at fashion, you can look at communications, you can look at defense, every sector of our economy. Anytime anything is manufactured, you're taking materials from the living world or from mines. You're taking materials and turning it into something. And for one thing, there's only so much of that. For another thing, it's a polluting process. Agriculture has been kind of rigged and jerry-rigged in a way to make it, to accelerate the rate at which we kill things and get a little bit of calories out of it.
And I'll point out on that notion that our agriculture is so heavily dependent on fossil fuels that we're basically eating some fraction of our fossil fuel energy. And at a 10-to-1 ratio, it takes 10 kilocalories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 kilocalorie of energy.
Yeah, and it need not be that way.
Right.
For generations and millennia, we ate food that did not require any fossil fuels to make.
That's right. And we would have failed sooner, prior to this inheritance of fossil fuels, if we had this overhang of having to spend more energy to put into the food than we got out, because that's a losing proposition. But we've gotten away with it because of the finite resource. And it's because of this finite resource that we have swelled our population to 8 billion people. Never would have happened without fossil fuels. And now we are way above what we could sustain without such an input. And that leaves us in an incredibly vulnerable position. And it's almost certain that that the waning of fossil fuels, which itself is a certainty because it's a finite resource, will be accompanied by a dramatic sort of reduction of human population, which is not likely to be a fun time, because that involves starvation and famine and a mass drawdown of our population. Nobody wants to see that, but we should have thought of that sooner. In a way,
there's a little bit of an idealist in me that says maybe we can identify let's say we did triage and we identified high priority activities, medium and low, and the high priority activities are well, they're the things that we need for food, water, health. The low priority activities are the ones that are actually destructive. and then there's everything in the middle. We could, in my view, scale down all the destructive activities and still support this population. But if we did that, that would be historically unprecedented for us to actually organize our affairs on a large scale in a way that actually benefits people,
Yeah, and it would require first a kind of widespread understanding that we have to jump off this train. That it's the tracks haven't been laid ahead, and there's a big chasm, and the train's going to go over, and so we have to jump off and risk some hurt and hardship in doing so, but it's our only choice. But meanwhile, the train is very comfortable, and people don't really, you can't, in a train, you can't even see ahead if you're a passenger. And so it's hard to make the argument that we need to do something so radical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we're basically going to cling to this system well beyond its usefulness, and we're just going to be dragged down by our own design.
I heard this recently. I don't remember who said it or whether it's true, but it's rang true at the time. And that is, somebody said that most of the people in India would be better off immediately if civilization collapsed, because they would be free to do what they have been doing, that kind of thing. There are people in the world who would immediately be better off if civilization collapsed, and those would tend to be people that have an indigenous lifestyle and or rural organic agriculture. The people that would suffer most are those who are in the cities, they depend on cities, and they can't quickly change that.
Yeah, I agree with that. The sort of the bigger they are, the harder they fall sentiment, that if you never really adopted much of the trappings of our civilization, the better equipped you are when those things crumble. And I am a product of the civilization. I'm not going to be one of those who does well in this evolution, and it's very sad to me. I mean, it causes me a lot of emotional distress, and in fact makes it hard sometimes for me to interact with other people, because I can see ahead, or at least, I mean, I could be wrong about all this, I have to admit, but in my mind, I can see ahead to the enormous suffering that is likely to happen, and doesn't have to. We could make some big changes in our attitudes and our expectations and avoid the worst. So we could make this a lot better. And so when I see people just sort of following the default path, which I can't blame them, I mean, that's just how things go. But I just see what their choices, that I see a cost to the choices that most people are making that isn't apparent to them, and it involves a lot of future suffering. And it's hard for me not to think of them as being criminally negligent in helping to propagate this system that's only causing ourselves, but many other species, great suffering.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to put on your benevolent dictator hat and ask what you would do if you were a benevolent dictator. Another variation on that question is, what would you do if you didn't think it was impossible?
Well, so I don't know, because fundamentally, I don't think anything really happens until attitudes change, and expectations. And so I don't know if that's really feasible to accomplish. And so I don't know that a dictator would be able to really move the needle. On the other hand, I can point to examples like Cuba, where when faced with a sudden kind of absence of Russian Soviet support, I think they lost 90% of their fossil fuel imports sort of overnight. And because they did have a dictator, a lot of people were forced into more subsistence agriculture living. And in that case, that authoritarian control probably really helped them. I think a democracy would fall apart under such stress. But because people just want things and they don't want to sacrifice. And so I don't know. I think I would certainly move to completely gut our economic system and just disband our market economy,
Mhm.
realizing that that comes with its own set of great suffering.
Mhm.
Okay, but part of our job here is to realize that we've dug ourselves a hole,
Mhm.
and there's no free way out of this.
Mhm.
And it's just sort of choosing the least destructive path to ourselves and to ecosystems. I don't know what that is. I don't spend time designing that because I'm not in such a position to carry anything out.
Right. So Dr. Thomas Murphy has been my guest, astrophysicist at University of California, San Diego. I want to give a few search terms that people can search. Do the Math is your blog. So Thomas Murphy, University of California, San Diego. Do the Math is the blog. The book is Energy and Human Ambitions on a Finite Planet. And there's one of your blog posts that we didn't get to very much is called Climate, a Love Story. And I want people to look up that one as well.
Yeah, that's basically the dream of renewable energy and why it might actually be a nightmare if carried out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom, for joining me.
Sure.